Hey there everyone. I figured because I've been having some good success with my Robin content recently that I figured it made sense for me to kind of go over some of the other options for the deck that I had been considering but hadn't put in the original deck tech. So without further ado, here is a quick little presentation on kind of cards I would consider for Robin, cooking up a new list. Alright, so just wanted to start off with top end and quick mention of what we have in the existing top end with the kind of pros and cons of what we're starting with. So our main cards that we're starting with, which I've gone over in the main deck tech video, are Yamato, Katakuri, Luffy, and Lin. Some of the pros to these: all of these cards are right away impactful, providing either heal or removal, or sometimes both. And they all have good bodies that are hard to remove in combat for your opponents, which can be really important with those top end cards. For all of these options, the heal and draw off of them help maintain your hand size, because one of the things that Robin struggles with is going too low on hand cards and being unable to defend themselves late game because of it. The other thing that's really important about all of these options here is they're compatible with Gum Gum Giant, which I'd argue is one of, if not the most powerful card in the deck, and it's the same reason we see Purple Luffy and Red Purple Luffy having so much success, and we're one of the few other decks who get to use that. Some of the cons though on these, because we're going into 9-drop plus Gum Gum Giant so regularly in the end game, you'll find that your deck gets a little bit too predictable sometimes, and that can really affect your ability to keep your opponent on the back foot when they have a pretty reliable way of predicting what you're going to do. Another piece that is difficult with the deck is all of these cards have on plays, so it can be difficult going into the Blackbeard matchup when your whole top end doesn't quite work. It's still serviceable because they have big enough bodies, and we do run a couple other cards that help us deal with Blackbeard's top end, but that really can be a downside, and some of the other options that we might look at might mitigate that limitation a little bit. And finally, these are unsearchable. One of the toughest things with Robin is because we don't get to have a dedicated package of cards, we run into spots where we will have a lack of consistency, and we can't really run a whole lot of the searchers because they will bottom deck our top end. So that's just kind of a look at our baseline. So let's go into some of the options for top end that we could consider. All right, so our first option that we're looking at, we have Douglas Bullet. He reads 8 cost, 10,000 power, no counter. Activate main once per turn, Dawn -4. Rest up to 2 of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less. Then this character gains double attack during this turn. So the main things that this card is going to do for us: you are going to be exerting a lot of pressure on your opponent the turn after you play this one, because it can deal with blockers. The double attack is always going to be a threat, and it's a monster in those situations. The downsides: it is low on impact on the turn it is played. This can be really problematic against some decks where you might not have additional turns and you really need your top end to do stuff. Additionally, it has a pretty steep Dawn investment. You can't use this ability back to back to back without a lot of investment into ramping back up. And so it's hard to recommend this one too highly, but it is definitely an option you can do if you're playing a more aggressive version. A notable synergy is with the Onami card, who can give him Banish. Banish double attack, baseline 10k, very, very strong. You will definitely crush a couple opponents if you can pull that combo off, with the downside of it not always quite getting there and sometimes leaving you a little vulnerable because it doesn't do anything right away. Next option we have is 7-drop Charlotte Lin. She reads 7 cost, 8,000 power, no counter. On play, your opponent chooses one of the following effects: trash 1 life from the top card of your opponent's life area, or put 1 card from the top of your deck onto your life area. So in briefer terms, it is a burn 1 of your opponent's life or heal 1 for you. Some of the pros for this one: it is only a 7 cost, which leaves you some flexibility for what to do with the rest of your Dawn. This will come up a couple times with our 7 costs. 7 cost fits nicely with a Shirahoshi from the main list and Gum Gum Giant, and that can be a really big advantage on 10 Dawn, being able to do that. The other advantage is this is hand pressure with either of the 2 options, because your opponent will have to invest hand into peeling off your life, or they'll lose life themselves. The cons are you will always get the lesser of those two options. Your opponent's never going to pick the mode that's worse for them, and the mode that's worse for them is going to be the one that you want them to pick, but they'll never do it. And the other downside to this one is it isn't great as the second or third top end card. All of the purple yellow decks have kind of fallen into a pattern where you ramp to get to your top end, and then you want to chain your top ends into each other. This Linlin has the downside that when your opponent is on 0 life, they can choose to trash that 0 life, and this Charlotte Linlin becomes worse than a vanilla because it doesn't have counter and it's not a 9k body. Notably, this one does synergize with Pudding, which is one of the options. I don't think we'll go over it too much this time because the searchers have the inherent downside of bottoming your other top end cards, and it's probably better if you're running Big Mom Pappage to be running the Pudding leader. But I did want to throw that in there that if you want to with Robin, you can pursue a very Big Mom Pirates heavy build in which Pudding may actually be viable. Next option is the 6 cost Big Mom. This one is a little different than the other. It works well with other low cost options so that you can continue to play out stuff when you're on 10 Dawn, or with stuff that's heavier on Dawn minus. One of the downsides to our existing top end sometimes is if you chain too many Gum Gum Giants or whatever, you stop being able to play your top end. This one gets around that at being only 6 costs, and it exerts very strong hand pressure with either of the options they choose. Going into what the card says, it's a 6 cost, 7k power, no counter. On play, you may trash 1 card from your hand. Your opponent chooses 1. Your opponent discards 2 cards from their hand, or trash 1 card from the top of your opponent's life cards. Both of those modes exert a lot of good hand pressure, either by taking their life without them being able to use it, or by having them discard 2. Like with the previous one, when you give your opponent a choice, they're always going to pick what's better for them, which is ultimately going to be worse option for you. And again, pointing out the synergy here with Pudding, which can make this part of your top end searchable, which is something the rest of our top end doesn't have. I will say though that the trash 1 card from your hand cost of her on play ability can be really harmful. A lot of times you will be playing early and be down to 3 or 4 cards very early, and when it comes down on curve, that's not necessarily as big of an issue because you have several life, but in the later stages of the game, that extra Dawn or a card that you throw away may be what is keeping you alive. So it's definitely a give and take with this one. Moving on to the next option, we have 10 cost Ace. He reads 10 cost, 10,000 power, no counter. On play, you may add up to 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life. Then if you have 2 life cards or less, this character gains Rush for the turn. Biggest advantage to this one is guaranteed heal. That's something that most of our other options don't always have. It's always going to work with Ace. And Rush that he has when you're at low enough life total often acts like removal. So in a lot of ways this looks like Yamato with a guaranteed heal. The difference is that you are doing it at 10 Dawn instead of 9, which makes it its biggest con that it is incompatible with Gum Gum Giant, which can make it real tough. If you draw too many top end cards, then you may find yourself with several bricks in hand, and you have to play one of these cards out, and it might not get you there. Notable, if you are running Ace and several of the other cards that we talked about, you will want to dip into the 0 cost events, potentially instead of Gum Gum Giant, but definitely alongside of at least some numbers. You want to be running the 0 cost event if you're running Ace. Next option we have is 10 cost Kaido and Linlin. They read 10 cost, 12,000 power, no counter. When attacking, Dawn minus 10, KO all other characters, then put up to 1 card from the top of your deck onto your life pile, and trash up to 1 card from the top of your opponent's life pile. The pros, and we'll get in, this fits with the synergy card I've kind of called out. This is part of a really strong kind of wombo combo. On your 10 Dawn turn, preferably if you can ramp into it a bit early, you can play out Kaido and Linlin, and then if your opponent is unable to deal with it ahead of time, then on the following turn you can play out a Kikunojo or potentially a Robin character to use up your Dawn, put the rest on your leader, swing, get a big banish hit, and then swing with Kaido and Linlin, do a Dawn -10, which will KO your Kikunojo, and her ability lets you then heal 1, and you will trash one of your opponent's life, and they will have a 12k coming at them. So one thing that you might see is if your opponent, say, is on 3 life, you start the turn, you play out Kikunojo, attach 6 Dawn to your leader, swing for 11. Most decks won't be able to counter out of an 11, so they'll take a life, be down to 2. Then you use Kaido and Linlin's ability, they go down to 1. Wipes their board, no more blockers available or anything like that, and they have a 12k attack to swing it to. And if they couldn't deal with 11k attack with banish, they can also not deal with a 12k. So in that combo, you gain 2 life, 1 from Kikunojo, 1 from Kaido and Linlin, and they lose 3 life, which can be a huge swing that even with the Dawn -10 ability may put you in a winning position. This is very all in. With that wombo combo and board clear thing, you also have the downside that it doesn't do anything the turn it's played, and that limits when you can play it. If you play it late, you may die as a result. You've spent all your Dawn, you don't have enough up for Gum Gum Giants or any blockers or anything like that, you may just die. And it's also, because it's a 10 Dawn play, it's incompatible with Gum Gum Giant, which is, as I'll kind of emphasized several times throughout this thing, is probably your best card in the deck. So this one is a very hot and cold. When it works, it's really strong. When it doesn't work, you would have been better with almost any other card. So that's Kaido and Linlin. Next, this one is on the edge of top end in our next category, mid-range, or mid-game. We have 7-drop Sanji. He reads 7 cost, 7,000 power, 1k counter. On play, you may return 1 or more of your Dawn cards from play to your Dawn deck. Then this character gains Rush for the turn, then rest up to 1 of your opponent's 6 cost or lower characters. This card, quite powerful. It is good that it's the 7 cost. Again, like I mentioned with Big Mom, you have the Shirahoshi plus Gum Gum Giant follow-up potentially. It having Rush means you can either use it for going for game or going at board, especially when you have the tap ability stapled on to it. Most of the time it's just a Dawn -1, but that Dawn -1, especially if you play it early, can be kind of problematic for your curve, so keep that in mind. And there are no heal and no draw on it, so you have to make sure that you are either capable of surviving the turn without that extra 1k counter, or you are finishing the game, because he doesn't do a whole lot to extend your defensiveness unless you can clear a board with him, which is a viable option. As far as synergies go, I wanted to call out the 1-drop Trafalgar Law, which, while it's a searcher, that's one of the ways you can kind of get into a searcher is if you have concentrate on Sanjis and Luffy's, which are both searchable by law, and then you can use your 2k slots for Straw Hats. And so you can potentially make a searcher work in those sorts of situations. So that's Sanji. Now we can move on to the mid-game. Baseline options for the deck, we have our 6-cost Robin, banish and pseudo-banish a life, 5-cost Nami, KO, 5-cost, and potentially at 0 cards in hand cost. Bonnie, a great card draw, card filtering option, especially late game when you can invest a lot of Dawn elsewhere to kind of guarantee that you'll get the trigger to go off. And then we have Lucy, who's a really good card draw and kind of control option, who is real hard to out if you can play it on curve. Going to general pros and cons, we have a lot of good removal options here. Lucy and Nami are both really good. Lucy, Nami, and Bonnie all have good triggers. Robin with the particularly high roll one, if you can find it with an Olvia and go to 8k leader for the turn. And then Bonnie and Nami both having quite strong situational triggers. The other good thing about the mid-game we have here is a lot of these cards have good backup plans, and they fit nicely into kind of in-game turns where you haven't drawn one of your top-end cards. You can play Bonnie and then invest some in leader to swing and try to find another Gum Gum Giant or blocker. You can play Nami to clear out a blocker and set up a lethal, and those are all kind of real nice flexible things. Cons to this group here is you'll notice a lot of these are relatively low on the power spectrum, which means that as you're building board in the mid-game, you may end up with a smaller body size than your opponent, which can be kind of a liability, not being able to use your bodies to help clear theirs while you wait for your top end to come online. And then Lucy in particular is very timing specific, and Robin as well, where sometimes they convert into either, in Lucy's case, no counter, or Robin's case, 1k counters if you miss that optimal timing for them. They're really strong when you do get to play them in their timing, but they do fade pretty heavily if they miss that timing. Going into some alternates that we can do for the mid game, we have this promo Zoro. He's a 6 cost 7k with 1k counter and banish. Very simple, everything kind of on its face. Its cost and power line up well against some of the removal options in the format, being a 6 cost that you can play on your 3rd turn going first, and 7k power is really hard for other decks to out. It dodges Beckman, it requires extra investment from Blackbeard to remove because he's at 6 cost. So those are probably the main things. And then one of the things with banish and with hand pressure that this deck tends to do is the more of it you can lay on, the more effective it gets. If you have just a little bit of hand pressure, your opponents can get around it, but if you have a lot of hand pressure, it can usually add up to more than the individual sum of its parts. Biggest con for this one is it's just not really a splashy play. There's a lot of times where you need something a little more impactful on the board at the time that he is on curve. And if you give up too much power in those points, you may fall behind. I do want to point out he is another Straw Hat, which means he's searchable with Law, which, as I mentioned before, there is probably a version of this deck that can run very Straw Hat heavy and as a result be able to run a Searcher for consistency's sake. The next card to go over is Miss All Sunday. This one plays kind of a different role than what Zoro did. This is your ramp option and some card draw. Because she has both ramp ability, a draw ability, and a trigger, it kind of fits everything that the deck needs. Her abilities read 5 cost, 5,000 power, no counter. On play, add up to 1 rested Dawn to your cost area, and if you have 6 or more Dawn, draw 1 card. The card draw will almost always be active. It's very rare for you not to be able to activate that card draw. And then she has a trigger, Dawn -2, play this card. In the situations where you play her, she's effectively a draw 2, because on that turn you don't have to use your leader ability to stay kind of on curve, and she draws a card herself. And that can be really powerful. This card tends to be quite good at filling out your curve because you can't run as many copies as you want of any other card. So it can really fill the holes. Biggest cons to it is it has no counter. That's probably the single biggest one. But secondarily, it also has kind of an awkward trigger. Dawn -2 is not without its cost. It's effectively a Dawn -1 because of the ramp that's on her. The issue being that if you say you play a Luffy with Rush in Dawn -1, and then you play a Gum Gum Giant, and that's a Dawn -2, and then you trigger this out of one of your life, and that's a Dawn -1. Suddenly you're not able to play another 9-drop following up after Luffy, and that can be really awkward. And if you see this one in life, and it is in one of those situations, you kind of have to just accept the card, because having a brick in hand can be really devastating late game if you don't have access to enough Gum Gum Giants or 0-cost events. I do want to point out the notable synergy here with Charlotte Katakuri, and he'll show up a lot in this video. If you play Miss All Sunday on curve, the following turn you can play your Katakuri, put All Sunday into life, and set up and get that heal, plus another card draw when she triggers, plus a body. So that's a lot of strong value. So if you find yourself running a lot of Charlotte Katakuri, Miss All Sunday is definitely a viable option. Next we have Gedatsu. He reads 5 cost, 6,000 power, 1k counter. On play, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost equal to or less than their life. This is another great removal option to play alongside Nami. It has a little bit of extra synergy with Banish, because your opponents are incentivized to guard their life when you're swinging with your Banish leader, which means that Gedatsu will be able to hit a little bit higher than he would in, say, an Enel deck. You don't have to starve to get the same effect with Gedatsu, essentially. The issue being that eventually you will get your opponent's life low, in which case he just converts into a 1k counter. Maybe you can snipe a Trump blocker, maybe a Nico Robin blocker out of Luffy or something like that, but he does reduce to a 1k counter pretty quickly to approach late game, And another con is he does not have a trigger, so you can't use him to discard to leader ability, which is something that a lot of our other mid-game cards did have access to. This one, while not as direct a synergy as Misal Sunday with Katakuri putting your opponent up 1 life when you use Katakuri in the removal mode makes Gedatsu get higher than you would expect in the late game. So not as pronounced synergy, but still quite good. Next we have Cracker. He's a 4-cost 5,000 power with 1k counter. He has Dawn ×1. When you have less life than your opponent, this character gains double attack and plus 1,000 power. He also has a trigger that is you may discard 1 card from your hand and play this card. One thing to note about his double attack ability, that is active on either player's turn and is not triggered. So if your opponent drops lower in life than you, the double attack and 1,000 power will drop off kind of at that moment. It checks constantly rather than setting itself once. Big pros to this. This is another double attack threat. Like I mentioned with Bullet, the extra pressure you can really push on opponents, especially in conjunction with Onami, can really hammer home the hand pressure that some other cards may not. He also, his trigger makes him sometimes a surprise late game. You may trigger into him if he's one of your last lives, and your opponent may be facing a lethal they didn't expect. On some cons, his trigger does cost you a card in hand, and like I was mentioning with 6 costs Linland, your deck is not one that has a thoroughly stocked hand all the time, and so that cost can really put you in a spot where you can't defend either your life or your characters very well. And then finally, if you don't trigger him out, he's really quite weak in the late game. He fits, you can play him alongside a blocker or whatever to try to set up some lethal turns, but he's not really all that remarkable at the very end of the game unless you trigger him out. Going into the next card, we have Kikunojo. So Kikunojo is a 4-cost 6,000 power, great stat line, no counter. On KO, if your opponent has 3 or less life, place the top card of your deck onto your life. So she heals if your opponent is low enough when on KO. Her trigger is if your opponent is at 3 or less life, play this card. So one of the pros, your opponents will not like removing this one, especially if you do manage to get them down to the 3 life where the KO comes on, the on KO ability comes on. And because of that, she has a pretty sticky body that your opponents aren't going to have as clean of answers with. It can also be a surprise body off trigger. Those are both great modes. Cons here, both the trigger and the on KO are limited in when they're active, and there may be a lot of times during the game where you can't use them. Especially true with Robin. Because of banish, your opponent is encouraged to keep their own life total a little bit higher, guard a little earlier, because the banish is such a potent threat against their life. Like I mentioned with Kaido and Linlan, we have that wombo combo synergy here, so keep that in mind. If you run one, it's probably right to run the other as well. Moving into the next one, we have Mr. 2, Bonclay. He's a 4-cost 1,000 power, 1k counter. On play, add up to 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck as active, and then when attacking, choose up to one of your opponent's characters. This character has the same base power as the chosen character for the turn. So this is another ramp option. It saves you a card in hand because you don't have to use leader ability that turn, and the ramp that it does do is active so that you can attach to leader and swing a little heavier with leader. Also, that second ability, the when attacking ability, can exert a lot of pressure on your opponent, kind of forces them to play in a weird way. If they can't remove it, then they can't play something that's too big, otherwise they're giving you a lot of power. Cons on it, it has no trigger, so if you miss the window when it's good for the ramp, then it doesn't come out of life nicely. It's just a 1k counter. And then additionally, it's also pretty weak in the late game. If you're just playing it out, it's just a 1k body that may threaten a big attack on the following turn. I want to call out specifically Ace and Kaido and Linlan as potential cards who would synergize with this, because if you're going first, you can get a triple ramp with Mr. 2 by playing this out when you're on 6 Dawn, and you get 3 opportunities to ramp and hit the Ace and Kaido and Linlan very early for going first curve. Next option, we have the 4-cost Kuzan from OP09. He reads 4-cost, 5,000 power, 1k counter. On play, you may place one of your opponent's 3-cost or lower characters on the top or bottom of their life face up. then your opponent trashes one card from their hand. So notably, you cannot do the trash without also doing the placing a card in their life. And so there is sometimes where this card is dead. Its pros are is it's really good against searchers and other cheap setup cards. You've got your Doc Q's, your Lafitte's in Blackbeard. You've got both of your searchers in Bonnie and some of their cheap chump blockers. You've got your Nico Robin in Purple Luffy and Law in Purple Luffy. You've got your Peronas and your Sengokus in Dofi. So he has a fair number of targets, but it's not all of the targets. The downsides to him is he does not have trigger, so he, outside of that 4 Dawn spot, can have kind of a lack of place to go. And some decks will have very few or no targets, which can make things awkward. Like if you're playing against a Pluffy and they don't open up playing Trafalgar Law, you may miss the window to play him. I wanted to call out with the 6-Trust Linlin, if you're running both of these, you're putting quite a bit of pressure on your opponent's hand with the discards from both of these abilities, and that can be pretty potent as you add it up. Next, I wanted to go over Soul Focus. This one is a real spicy option. It is a 5-cost event. It has main. Your opponent chooses one of the following effects. Trash 1 life from the top of your opponent's life area, or put 1 card from the top of your deck on top of your life area. So it has the exact same text as Linlin's on-play ability, but on a cheaper event, and the event has trigger. Activate this card's main ability. That trigger, very strong. When it's on a 7-cost body, it's a little less strong, but when it's completely for free off a trigger, it's a very strong ability. It is a late game. It's cheap enough to pair with a blocker and potentially a Gum Gum Giant, which can be good. Cons, in the late game, it is a brick. If you do not have a good opportunity to play it out, it's going to be a real rough spot. If you haven't been able to exert enough pressure, then all you're doing is burning 1 life card and not keeping yourself alive. And just like with the 7-cost Linlin, they're always going to pick the worst of the 2 effects. I do want to kind of reemphasize, if you can add on more copies of the same effect, it can get more powerful because your opponent can only choose the bad option a certain number of times before it really starts to add up. Now on to a little bit of a category in the mid-game. We're going into the Egghead cards. There's several of these, and they all kind of synergize. They have that notable synergy with the Iroquois Help, or Please Save Me, as it was originally fan translated. So S-Snake is the first one. 5-cost, 6,000 power, 1k counter. On play, up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less, other than Monkey D. Luffy, cannot attack until the end of your opponent's next turn. And then it's got a trigger, activate this card's on-play ability. So this is a strong trigger to have, especially if you are running into the late game. You can really kind of, not quite a Beji, but close to a Beji's worth of ability. And this is a potentially really good effect for bridging into a Yamato, because you play it on 6 Dawn, going into 9 on the following turn. Essentially the guy that you freeze can be KO'd with Yamato, and they can't attack into your life, so Yamato is even more likely to be able to have that reach. Cons are, this is really temporary protection. It only works for the turn, so that you haven't really dealt with the threat. You've just kind of delayed it. And then specifically its on play is shut off by Blackbeard's ability because it says activate this card's on play effect. Similar to how Nami works, where it does not trigger against Blackbeard. And another small rules note for this one, Monkey D. Luffy is the specific name, so Luffy Taro is not Monkey D. Luffy. So if you run into any spots where someone's running a card that's Luffy Taro, you can still use this ability on it. And then the synergy, and this is true for all of the Egghead ones, the trigger on Iroquois Help is play up to 1 5-cost Egghead type character from your trash, which means that when it triggers, it effectively gives you triggers off of any of your other Egghead cards, which is quite a strong place to be. Going into the next Egghead one, I wanted to call it S-Hawk. It is a 4-cost 5,000 power character with 1,000 counter. It has Dawn times 1. While your life total is lower than your opponent's, this character has plus 2,000 power and cannot be KO'd in battle by cards with the slash attribute. That line alone makes it a quite potent attacker, especially in the mid game. You can really kind of exert some pressure on your opponent's bodies and stuff. with this, you play it out early. And then it also has trigger. You may trash one card from your hand, and then if you have 2 or less life, play this character. So pros, this one can be that surprise body from late, strong attacking body in the mid game, like I mentioned. Cons, you do need the Dawn attach, which can be kind of hard to manage with your top end. If you're running 9 costs and Gum Gum Giant, you don't usually have it to spare, but there will be times when you can to get that extra boost out of it. And like before, it's got that great synergy with I Request Our Help. Now moving on to kind of our last category I wanted to go through, which is our events and defense. So our baseline options, we have Brachio Bomber and Kingdom Come for removal, both great cards. And then defensive options, we've got Gum Gum Giant and Shirahoshi. So our pros, those removal options we are running here are quite strong. And then on defensive options, they're quite cheap, so it makes turns very flexible. And this is most notably for Brachio Bomber and Kingdom Come. The timing on when these cards come out in curve or when you would want to play them lines up quite nicely with where your curve actually ends up. On your 6 Dawn, your opponent will have just had their 4 Dawn turn. Perfect spot to ramp another card and KO. And then late game, when your opponent's playing those big bodies that can't be answered else by your other removal, Kingdom Come comes in and you're usually at 1 life. So both of those have really nice kind of timing windows for them. Cons, none of these cards are very great when you're behind. If your opponent is kind of playing a few bodies and swinging with a few bodies, you can try to last another turn, but you're not developing your board with any of these things. And then particularly with Shirahoshi and Gum Gum Giant, your opponents do have options of how they can play around them, and Gum Gum Giant's telegraphed, Shirahoshi's already on the board. So if your opponents know the matchup well, they can be kind of played around and kind of put you in spots where you can't rely on them as much as the power, straightforward powered on the card would suggest. Going into some alternatives, these first two are removal options. They're both cheap and both have trigger, so they don't have too much opportunity cost to put them in. You can always just use them for early or flexibly in the late game with their cheap cost, and then the trigger, just toss them to leader ability. The kinds of cards you want to remove with them are usually removable around the time you need them to be. Buzzcut Mochi would probably be the one that I would choose as my favorite over these two, just because it more consistently hits the kinds of cards you might want to, your Onamis or your 4 costs out of Doflamingo or Floofy. It can hit those more reliably, whereas 300 million volt Thunderbird or Hino Bird Zap, I think is what the English name is for it, it gets less strong at the end of the game. The main cons with these compared to our other things is there's just more situations where they're dead, where they just stop working, whereas some of our other ones don't stop working and they just have higher Dong investment to compensate them. Both of these, though, do care about your opponents having more life, so there's a little bit of micro synergy here with Katakuri healing one of their guys into life and then removing another one because you've turned on Buzzcut Mochi or Bird Zap. Next two are the zero cost events. All the zero cost events read zero cost counter. You may trash 1 card from your hand if your leader or one of your characters up to 3,000 for the battle. They have 2 different triggers here. Probably the yellow one is going to be the one that we would opt for, but I wanted to cover them both because they both have some niches is when you might want to use them. The yellow one's trigger is if you have 0 life cards, put the top card of your deck onto your life pile, then trash 1 card from your hand. Notably, that is not a cost, that trash card from hand, so if it is you have no cards in hand and it's your last life, you will still get that extra life, and that is the perfect last life trigger. And then the purple one has add up to 1 Dawn card from your Dawn deck and set it as active, which is the perfect first trigger to see in your life. So their triggers can have some balance there. The upsides to these would be if you get the triggers on the right time, then they can be real strong. The downsides being that sometimes the discarded card is too harsh of a cost for a deck that's already kind of low on hand. You may have to throw away cards that are really too important to throw away just to survive with that. It is important to consider these, though, if you're running 10 costs when you can't hold up Dawn for Gum Gum Giant. So just something to kind of balance. when you're considering your deck. The next two, 2000 volts Amaru and Flame Split, or Blaze Slice, I think maybe in the English. These two both operate pretty similarly. I'll read them out here. Amaru is 2-cost main, rest up to one of your leaders or characters gains plus 3000 power during the turn. Then if your life is 1 or less, rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 4 or less. And its trigger is you may trash 2 cards from your hand, add up to 1 from the top of your deck to your lifetime. This one is part of a cost, so you don't get a free heal if you're on 0 cards at the end of the game with Maru, but it is still a very strong trigger. And then Blaze Slice is 1 cost, main or counter, give up to one of your leaders or characters 1000 power for the turn, and then after this, if your opponent has 2 or less life, rest up to one of your opponent's 4 cost or lower characters, with a trigger of rest up to one of your opponent's 4 cost or lower characters. So with both of these, the triggers can be really impactful, especially late. You can either eat an attack with them or heal a new life. They both function similarly, that they're really good at getting around in-game blockers right at the end of the game when their life stipulations are kind of naturally turned on. Cons, they are both the timing limited. They're not as great in the mid-game as some other cards might be. And they also have no counter, which is going to be true of most of our events here. They're not really good at protecting us. They're more good at kind of going for game. Both of these are quite good with the Banished Zoro. Getting rid of a blocker and adding some extra power to your Banished Zoro and the Banished Leader, you can kind of sneak out some games where your opponent thought they were safe behind a blocker and thought they might be safe with cards in hand, and you can kind of get around that in a way that they can't counter out. Next one, and this we've kind of gone over in the earlier spot. I Rayquaza Help, please save me, translated here. 1 cost, counter, if you have 2 or less life, give up to one of your leaders or characters plus 3000 power during this battle. So nice solid thing. It's nice that it also costs 1, so your opponent will never know if you're holding up 1 Dawn for this or for Giant. And 3000 is quite strong if your opponent wants to try to do 7s to try to thread the needle between getting you to use Gum Gum Giant or getting you to use 1s and 2Ks. This is great for combating that, and it's not too bad if you use this plus a 2K. It is 2 cards out of your hand, whereas if you use Gum Gum Giant plus a 1K that you draw, it's 1 card out of hand, so it's only one additional card out of hand to get out of a 9K. And then other pro is that those great trigger things of bringing back your S-Snakes. If you're going to run this, you definitely want to run the rest of the Egghead package to go with it. Other issues, it does have that timing window. If your opponent sniffs out that you are sitting on this one instead of Giant, they can leave you at 3 life potentially, and then this is for a bit. And you can't run too many 1-cost events because you can only usually use 1 of them in a turn. So keep that in mind, that you can't run this for free alongside Giant. There is both the advantage that you always can use that 1 Dawn that you hold up, but also the disadvantage that you can only really use 1 of them in a turn most time. Getting into another blocker, we have Jaguar D Sol, 3 cost, 5000 power, no counter with blocker. And then he has a trigger. If your leader is Nico Robin, play this card. So pros on this one, he is a blocker who comes out for free. You get him out of trigger. He's got a nice attacking body, and it's something you can play early because 3 Dawn is one of the more awkward spots in the game for Robin. So sometimes being able to play this one out and establish body a little earlier can be good. Cons on it, it has no counter, which if you don't get a chance to play it out, may be a real liability. He does work pretty nicely with Shark-Headed Curry, as several other cards have also done. You can play him out early, swing with him once, and then throw him in life with your Katakuri, so you can come out and block again. Similarly, we have a different trigger blocker. This one trades the 5K body for a 1K counter. It's Charlotte Brûlée, 3 cost, 1K body, 1K counter, blocker, trigger, just play this card. So similar pros to Sol, it's just a free block at the end of the game. It does have counter, so it's never truly dead like Sol is, but it has a very weak body that can be operated around, like Red can remove it, or you won't be able to attack with it. And so again, with Charlie Katakuri, it's a nice spot. This one's a little less nice than with Sol, but if you ever trigger it out early and you don't find the need to block with it, you can use Katakuri to put it back and get another life out of it. Next is Derishishi. 3 cost, main. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck, reveal up to 2 cards with trigger other than Derishi, and add them to your hand. Then return the rest to the bottom of your deck in any order, and trigger a draw card. This is a pretty good card advantage card, filling out kind of that weaker moment in the curve I was mentioning earlier. That 3 cost or 3 Dawn turn is not necessarily a big power play for Robin, so it's a nice place to fit it in. The biggest con, and this is probably the reason I would not recommend running this one, is it can't find Gum Gum Giant, it can't find your top end. So any of the 5 cards that you see that isn't those triggers, they're going to the bottom, and that's a lot of times going to be your top end and your Gum Gum Giants, which are some of the most important cards in the deck. For synergies, I think this is one where you want to definitely be considering running the 0 cost event to help you get rid of Derishi at inopportune moments, because it's only really castable at 3 Dawn or at 10 Dawn after you've run out of top end. So there's a lot of times where it doesn't do anything. Also, just worst case, just pitch it to leader ability. But again, I wouldn't recommend this one. Putting Gum Gum Giant and your leader, your top end to the bottom is way too expensive of a cost. Now I wanted to go into some considerations while you're taking all these kind of pieces together. First one is consider what your curve is and make sure you have enough plays for each cost along the way. Make sure you've got enough 5s and 6s to play on those early turns. Make sure you've got enough 9s and 10s to consistently hit them. But then the other piece is to make sure you are considering what you're going to do, particularly on that 6 to 9 gap. There's going to be some times where you need to play a 3 and a 6 instead of a 9 on that first 9 Dawn turn or stuff. So just make sure you are including enough pieces along the way, because there really is a cap on how much top end you can play. There are going to be bricks and you can't run all of it. So make sure you're considering the rest of the curve. On the topic of top end, can't run all of it, so you have to pick. So really the decision kind of comes down to a lot. Are you running the Yamatos, Luffy's, and Linlins with Gum Gum Giant, or are you running your aces, Kaido Linlins, which work better with the 0 cost event? Just be careful when you're picking them, because they don't all synergize together. If you are running ace, you probably can't run a full playset of Giant. You have to run some number of 0 cost events. If you're running Yamato, the 0 cost event may be redundant and may hurt your hand too much. So just things to consider. This is the next thing following up after your top end. Plan out what you want to do when your top end runs out. You can't run all top end because you'll have too many bricks. So you have to run some of these cards, and your top end will run out eventually. So figure out how you want to pursue the game past that. If you're running a little more defensive thing, you can run a Sanji plus a Shirahoshi plus a Gum Gum Giant to last another turn. Sanji being your ability, giving you ability to kind of go at their board, really lock in that last turn. You can run Nami, remove a blocker, Hamaru, tap a blocker, and then go for lethal. So there's an option there. Or Onami, give something banish, invest a bunch of Dawn, go for multiple vanishes. Kind of identify what your kind of backup mode is going to be, and make sure you build enough copies of those things in hand. Next, and this one is important, I think, with most decks, but you have only a limited number of 0 counter cards you can run in a deck. A lot of them are going to be filled up with your top end, and the 0 cost event can give you some leeway on running a few extra, but don't run too many, because you won't draw the 0 cost all the time, and you can't Gum Gum Giant away every single 0 cost or 0 counter card. So you have to be kind of judicious at which of the 0 counter cards you actually include. I don't know if I've heard this before or if this is something I came up with. You're playing a glass deck, don't run too many bricks. So just something to keep in mind. The next thing is triggers. Robin is a deck that really thrives off of having enough triggers to make the leader effective. That ramp part of the ability is actually really important. You're running a 4-life leader, you have to be able to get some advantage out of it. The advantage that Robin gets is getting to her top end sooner and then having some good pressure. If you took away either of those 2 abilities, the deck wouldn't work. Trigger cards, though, are not the strongest cards you can play on curve. So cutting lower on triggers lets you run stronger main things. That said, triggers, when they do hit out of life, are free value. So there's kind of a push and pull of playing the strongest cards on curve versus playing cards with trigger. And then of course you want to make sure you hit enough triggers for your leader, but you only usually do that twice in a game. So you don't need to have 50 triggers in your deck. You're only going to use it probably twice in a game. So keep that in mind. And with that, I am done with kind of my alternates. I wanted to thank you guys. I've had a lot of success recently with my Robin content, and I really appreciate that you guys are coming out and supporting the videos and commenting. Please like, comment, subscribe, particularly if there's something that I missed that you want me to talk about. Throw it in the comments and I'll be sure to reply. And otherwise, I will see you in whatever I do next. Thank you.